Welcome to today's webinar on finding and researching your Union Civil War ancestors. My name is Ginevra Morse, the Online Education Coordinator at the New England Historic Genealogical Society. I'll be moderating today's event. NEHGS is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer this webinar today for our members and friends around the world. Giving today's presentation will be David Allen Lambert, our Chief Genealogist. He's been with the Society for more than 20 years and is an expert in New England and Atlantic Canadian research, military records, and Native American and African American genealogical research. He will go over the basic steps of researching your Union soldier ancestor, provide information on the types of records you're likely to encounter, and offer tips on how to access those records, especially when held at the National Archives. At any point during the presentation, please feel free to type a question in the panel to the right of your screen. David will answer as many as he can in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the hour. If you don't see that question box, you can expand the user panel by clicking on the icon of a white arrow with an orange background that looks like this. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted to our website in the next couple of days. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to David.
Thank you, Ginevra. One of the things I find that's really valuable with genealogy is looking outside the names and dates that we're usually restricted to in forms that we fill out or on genealogy programs, maybe online. Names and dates seem to be the thing that populate most of our research. I like to look a little outside the box and breathe life into the story of an ancestor and learning all the aspects I can. One of the strongest parts of that is looking at military research. Military research has often populated the biography, the timelines of many genealogy over the years, and really will add color to a chapter of your ancestor's life. What I'd like to talk about today is the Civil War, and the Civil War was very much involved in the loss of many lives of both Union and Confederate. Over 600,000 lives, in fact, were lost, and in the Battle of Gettysburg during that campaign, over 51,000. So chances are you have a veteran that may have actually lived and perhaps even died during the war. Now, in the memories of the Civil War, there's probably some of you out there that actually may have known a Civil War veteran, may be a relative or an elderly neighbor. In fact, in 1956, when Albert Wilson died at the age of 109, he was the last remaining Civil War veteran. And bringing forward to the 21st century, Gertrude Janeway, who was the age of 93 in 2003 when she died, was the last pensioned Union widow. Now, as it stands right now, as of 2014, there are documented cases of over 20 living children of Civil War veterans. Yes, I did say children. And many of you may have actually known one, but to the idea that there are children still alive. In fact, one that I have recently talked to, who died in July, had turned 99. Her father was the last Vermont veteran, and New Englanders can only claim one living child now who lives down in Virginia. Her father was a Maine veteran. Step 1, determine whether your ancestor served. Now, the one thing you have to take in mind with any aspect of research is, does the ancestor fit the description of the particular military campaign? Now, for most times, you look at a soldier, you think that anybody who's going to defend their country, they're going to just pick up the gun and go. Well, by the 19th century, they're actually looking for men in good health. So if your ancestor had been ill or may have been lame in any sort of way, when he had a draft registration done, it's quite possible that he may have been stamped as unfit for service. Now, this draft registration is available online. Ancestor.gov has digitized them, and they were set up by congressional draft boards and were available, and you might find your ancestor listed in it, but what I do want to highly stress is that even though he was listed does not mean he actually served. You may also find in the draft registration the reason why your ancestor couldn't serve. You may also find in it a place of birth and an age or something that you may have not found. So do search for your ancestor in these registrations. Now, the one thing to also keep in mind is obviously his age. How old was he back in 1861 at the start of the war? Now, most soldiers were the average age of 18 to 30, but there were extremes in the case of the Civil War. There are soldiers reported in their 60s, so you could have someone born as early as, say, 1790 and born as late as 1850. And in some extremes in the Confederacy, there were even smaller children that were serving to defend the Confederacy towards the end of the war. Now, one thing which is a little comical in a way, but you might have to know that your ancestor had good teeth, especially if he was going to join the infantry. The way a musket is loaded is you reach into the cartridge box and tear the cartridge, pour the black powder in the ball, and use the rammer and shove it all down the gun. In the line of battle, the last thing you want to do is not have teeth and try to tear a cartridge with just your gums. Being a Civil War reenactor myself, I can tell you that if I had false teeth, I probably wouldn't have taken on that hobby. And in the Civil War, chances are if your ancestor was in this predicament, probably went into the artillery. As it is true with many people, especially here in New England, there are always treasures in the attic. There's always that one home in the family that has that old trunk. Or maybe it was your grandmother's house and you're the lucky person who has all of the diaries and the letters and the photographs. These really offer an interesting glimpse. For many people, research in the American War starts in the Revolution. And though there were photographs of Revolutionary War surviving soldiers later in life, the Civil War is at the height of photography, and paper photography, such as a carte de visite, could be easily identified and mailed home for very cheap money. So your ancestor may have mailed a photograph or had one taken beforehand, adding a different glimpse into the life of the veteran. Now, you may also have some military ephemera. May it be the uniform or belt, or the kepi, or the forage cap, which is the hat that the ancestor would have worn in the military, usually with the number of the regiment or an emblem that represents the field of the military he's in. May it be the infantry, the artillery, or maybe something from the Navy. Now, also because soldiers are in the heat of battle in the relaxed time after the camp life, occasionally they would swap things they found on the battlefield. May it be a piece of a cannon that broke apart or a button from the enemy's uniform. Something may have been picked up off the battlefield as a memento and keepsake of this tragic event. Now, the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that a lot of times we have oral tradition. Oral traditions like the old telephone game we did when we were kids. Paper, cup, and string. Well, now you're doing it over generations, and in this case, over 150 years. So something may have been lost in tradition. That being said, your ancestor who heroically fought at Gettysburg may have been heroically fighting the battle from a hospital 40 miles away, or worse, you can find out that he may have been AWOL and not even there. So heroes and some of the stories may not be so heroic. So that oral tradition, your research will help you thin out the falseness of the story true to the facts. Now, one thing that I always enjoy doing is wandering through cemeteries. It must be something about being a genealogist that drives me to graveyards, but I particularly like looking for the veteran stones. Now, one thing that you may find is a GAR flag marker. Now, this is going to be usually a bronze or, in some cases now, plastic marker that will say GAR. That stands for the Grand Army of the Republic. Started immediately after the Civil War, this organization was a fraternity for the veterans of the Civil War. And in often cases, they would even provide a gravestone for their comrade members and sometimes grave plots, as you can see in the lower photograph on your screen. This is the Grand Army plot in Stoughton, Massachusetts, where there were the burials of 7 veterans. These 7 veterans were soldiers who did not have family and were buried there to accommodate for the lack of perhaps financial accommodations to buy their own plot. Now, veterans plots are very popular till this day, but they started in the time of the Civil War. Military gravestones are also something that you may have for your ancestor, as the one on the right for William E. Hill of Company D, 55th Massachusetts Infantry. The one thing that you may find on this stone is that it doesn't give a name and a date. So it's often hard to determine when the soldier died, especially if the cemetery records are not good. There are gravestone applications online on Ancestor.com that accommodate some of the applications for these stones, or hopefully there's a family marker nearby that it gives the names and the dates. These markers are not too different than what they're still provided from the government today. Now, the federal census and state censuses are another good place to search for clues. We're going to talk about federal censuses of 1890, 1910, and 30, and we'll talk about some of the state censuses that are available that give you some indication of service in the military during the Civil War. The 1890 special schedule of the census was taken to accommodate all Union veterans and surviving soldiers, Marines, and widows. Now, populated generally by Civil War veterans, you will also find the occasional Indian War and Mexican War veterans. The last Mexican War veteran, just for the statistics, died in the 1920s. Now, what we have on the screen here are a variety of soldiers listing their names as well as sailors. Then we'll look at the first one. Elbridge G. Hadley, who was a private in Company A, 16th Massachusetts. He enlisted July 2nd, 1861, and discharged July 27th, 1864. And then here on the right gives his length of service. Now, if you follow this column down to the bottom line, you'll find number 13 matches up with line 13 up here. And this actually gives you his post office address. He's living in Cambridge, Massachusetts at 6 Oak Street. He has no disability incurred, but it does say that he was on a detachment for service through December 6th to the end of the war. Now, you also will find on here that there is the name of a widow. In this case, Mary McCarthy, the widow of Michael Shaughnessy. Seems a little interesting. The last name's the same? No, it's not. She's a remarried widow. So if your ancestor's widow remarried, she may also be listed in this. Now, the 1890 census may be a little curious to you because, unfortunately, most of the federal census for the 1890 was destroyed in a fire in the 20th century. In fact, the surviving schedules of the 1890 veteran only survive for states K through W. Unfortunately, as I understand it from the National Archives, in the 1940s, states A through I were inadvertently thrown out, thinking they served no purpose since the earlier census that they correlated with was burned. The next census we'll talk about is the 1910 federal census. This census is very busy with information on the screen, and you may miss column number 30, located over here on the right-hand side, and there's a blow-up we have for you down here. And what column 30 asks is whether a survivor of the Union or Confederate Army or Navy. So in that small space, you're going to see either UA or CA for the Army of the Union or the Confederacy, or UN or CN for the Navy of the Union or the Confederacy. This might be that first clue that you find while looking at a census that indicates your ancestor did in fact serve in the Civil War. The next census jumps ahead 20 years. The 1920 did not have an indication on military service, but by the 1930 census, we had already gone through World War I. Of course, in this time, it was listed just as the World War, and that is where you will find in columns 30 and 31 of the 1910 census the following. Whether you were a veteran of a U.S. military or naval force mobilized for any war or expedition. Now, of course, this will cover surviving Civil War veterans, because at this point in time, they're going to be in their late 60s, 70s, 80s, or even older. It will say yes or no whether they were in the service, and this is where you find other military service listed besides the Civil War. For under what war or expedition, they'll generally put CW for the Civil War, but you might see SPAM. No, it doesn't mean spam. It means the Spanish-American War. You may also find PI for Philippine Insurrection. You may also find IND or IW for Indian Wars. And you may find, again, for the more current war related to the decade of 1930, WW for World War I. Now, besides the federal censuses, it's always a great bonus to a genealogist when you can find someone in a state census. A great book by Ann Lanehart on state censuses was published a number of years back, but I'm going to give you a sampling of the 3 states that highlight Civil War related data. The 1865 census here for the town of Stoughton, Massachusetts has an Irish immigrant, age 42, Hugh Diamond. This widower was a laborer, but he had also served briefly as a soldier in the Civil War, as indicated under his profession on occupation column. This is just one of many ways of determining your military service of your ancestor, in this case in the state of Massachusetts, and these are online from Family Search as well as available at NEHGS for your viewing. In the Union, that would be Rhode Island. The 1865 census had question under column 15 over here, and it asks employment in the military or naval service of U.S. since 1860. So you may even get an indication someone was already in the service before the Civil War, the year before 1861. Now the question is simply, now in the Army or Navy, or formerly in the Army or Navy. So you can find out if someone is still under their enlistment or they had been discharged. Now the interesting thing about this is it's not going to reflect later wars because we're not in any at that point in time. And we're not going to reflect the earlier wars. So this is really geared specifically towards Rhode Island residents that had Civil War service. You may also get an indication as to what state they served in, both in the Navy or in the Army. As you can look down in the column here, you'll find NY for New York. This isn't always indicated. Sometimes it's simply a check mark, but sometimes you actually get the state abbreviation. The next census I'm going to show you for a state census in the last is that of New York, and under columns 25 through 28 you will find whether the person was employed in the Army or the Navy. Looks a little similar to what Rhode Island did. In fact, it's exactly the same questions. So this might find a very interesting aspect for you. And you may also look at the end of each of the census schedules for New York under the community when it ends. There's additional inquiries relating to officers and enlisted men now in the military and naval service where they supply additional data for you. So do look beyond the actual census, and then what you're going to do is, for instance here, you'll have your household number and your family number. Use that to correspond at the end of each one of the census pages for that town with the household and the family number here, and you'll get that specific details. We're going to talk now about state sources, and every state is going to be different on their holdings, but occasionally you're very lucky. What we have for New Hampshire on microfiche at NEHGS in our microtext department are a valuable collection of New Hampshire enlistment papers that have been microfiched. These documents include a clue that most genealogists seek in military records, the identity of a parent. In the case here, we have Edward Brigham enlisting in the military from the state of New Hampshire, but below is the rest of the document where his father, Charles A. Brigham, attests that his son is 18 years of age and signs his name, giving permission for his son to bear arms against the Confederacy and serve in the state of New Hampshire. In most cases, military records don't indicate who the parents are, and the only time you get it aside from that is if the soldier dies and the father or mother applies for a pension. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we discuss pensions. Now, states also have published compilations of veterans. In the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, a multi-volume set, The Massachusetts Soldiers, Sailors, and Marines in the Civil War, published in the earliest 20th century, were culled from the records of the Adjutant General's office. Now, maybe there's not a great detailed set for your state, but no doubt the Adjutant General of your state did have annual reports in 61 through 1865. Also look at 1866 that may indicate Civil War service by regiment, company, and soldier, and also a listing of those involved in the Navy. Another valuable state source, and again it's different from every state, there may be a collection of the GAR membership lists. These would be the annual returns of the encampments of the GAR in your state, or they may be the muster rolls, sadly, of the members that died. Wherever the case might be, GAR records are a very valuable tool to indicate the post-Civil War life of your ancestor. Step 2. Determine which regiment your ancestor served in. Now, what I'd like you to use is a free website by the National Parks, and the website link is down below. And this allows you to search both on soldiers, sailors. You can also find out information about the regiments and the engagements that your ancestor served in. It's a wonderful database. I was delighted to be involved well over 15 years ago now in the purely volunteer system that was put forth to index these compiled military service records and sailor lists from ship logs and from other databases. This is both Union and Confederate. For this search, I'm just going to simply use my own name. David in the first name category, Lambert in the last name. Now, I've cased for this one because we're talking about Union soldiers today, Union veteran. I didn't select the state, nor have I picked a battle unit or a function. So I'm going to hit search under show results, and I find 14 David Lamberts serving in the Civil War. Now, the first one we have here is a David Lambert who served in the 1st Regiment, Pennsylvania Reserve Infantry, also known as the 30th Volunteers. Now, I'm not going to click on David Lambert, but I am going to click on the regiment that he served in, and you're going to get a nice little detail about who he was involved with. This is a capsule unit history, sort of a taste of what a compiled military service record would be, taking all the detail of your ancestor and kind of like a mini version of a regimental history. What they provide here is an overview of when the regiment was called up in 1861, where they moved to, and where they were actually stationed to the end of the war in 1864 when that unit got out. Now, the end of the war, of course, was until 1865, so you might want to search, and this is an additional tip, for other units your ancestor may have transferred into. Now, during the service of the unit, it also lists the battles that they were in, and there are hyperlinks in here to go to more details on particular battles. Maybe the Battle of Gettysburg, Battle of Gaines Mills, or Fredericksburg. I'm sure you'll find that your ancestor's unit being at these places may encourage you to go on a genealogical field trip to one of these battlefields of the Civil War history of our country. Now, one of the things that you want to be able to get is from that data is you have his unit and you have his name, or you have the soldier's unit and you have the vessel he served on. So you can request a copy of these compiled military service records through inquire at arch2.nara.gov, right on your screen, or you can visit the NARA website. Now, what you can do when you order these up, or you can do it two ways. You can do it by a traditional downloadable PDF file of the form, or you can actually order online. This is the NATF 86 order form. And what this order form is good for is ordering up the records of any veteran who is in the Union Army, or you can even get into the Confederate Army, their rank, what unit they served with, whether it be infantry, cavalry, artillery. You want to put in the veteran's name, the state in which he served in, the war, in this case the Civil War, and you want to provide additional information, his date of birth, place of birth, date of death, or place of death. And you can make requests for, and this costs simply $30, and they will make either paper copies for you or burn it on a CD or a DVD. Again, you can request these records by that form, or you can simply go on to the link below and make a request online for the service records. And this is an online auto-filled form, paid with a credit card. This is an example of a company muster roll abstraction card, or part of what you would find in a compiled military service record. This compiled military service record will have individual sheets that were culled from the muster rolls. This will say, in the case of this veteran, Samuel Hollister, he is involved in the Company M of the 1st New York Mounted Rifles, and he served, in this case, January to February 1864, and then he's actually present. There'll be a card for then February and March and April, etc. And each one of these cards will be culled from the actual muster roll of the veteran. These were done in the late 19th century by the War Department to help accommodate both searching for veterans who were entitled to pensions and also made it much easier to index what soldiers and when they served. Other sources that you can use for finding your ancestor include town histories. Many 19th century and early 20th century town historians would include chapters on the military service of their community. In this case, the Civil War would play heavily in deciding the outcome of the town's history, and often you will find the unit history capsule, especially if a company was raised from a town, or you might find little unit histories of each company, or maybe even individual biographical sketches of each veteran. In some cases, even photographs or engravings, as you have one here for a veteran from New Hampshire. County histories are also good for the same thing. Your ancestor may have been in college at the time of the war, so try his college yearbook or alumni registers. As this one here from the class of 1863 from Harvard University, we find out the life of William Frederick Jones, who his parents were, when he was born, that he left college at the first term of his sophomore year and went into business with his father, but then ultimately went with the 44th Massachusetts in 1862 and served until June of 1863. Nice thing about this is it also gives his later life after the war. There are again statewide compilations of veterans, which I mentioned earlier, but do look for those because it might save you having to recreate and compile an entire list of veterans in your ancestors unit, which will come very important when you're trying to determine where your ancestor was in battles. And again, remember the 1890 U.S. Census special schedule to determine where your ancestor may be after the war. Now, one tip that I'd like to throw out there is that we always like to concentrate on our own ancestors, but I want you to look a little outside of your own direct ancestors. Now, in this case, maybe cousins, brothers, or uncles, or maybe even his father. Remember that age range that I said, 1790 to 1850. Any potential ancestors that fit into the unit of that age may be considered or may have been briefly a Civil War veteran. So when you look for your ancestor, also try those family members as well. Step 3, learn about your ancestor's regiment. What you want to do about learning your ancestor's regiment is going to be finding out specifically some details. The details, what battles did they actually fight in? So remember that oral tradition that you had, your ancestor was at Gettysburg? Find out if the unit was even actually there. Or more importantly, was your ancestor still enrolled actively in his unit at that time or on the vessel when they were at that naval engagement? You also want to learn who the commanding officers were, because if you can locate the records on the officers, they may have more detailed records, may have had diaries, may have had actual official reports that were sent in to determine where they were, what different engagements they have, or what issues they were facing during the war. And lastly, if you have the time, and this is true with anything from the colonial wars right on through to the 20th century, adopt the company your ancestors served in or the other members that were on a vessel with him, because knowing the other unit veterans are going to be very useful. Maybe your ancestor didn't live long enough to get a pension. Maybe there is no diary or letters about your ancestor. But if you adopt the regiment and learn other people who served with him, you may get to fill in the blanks by learning their story. Now, there are sources to use for this, of course, of the National Parks website that I introduced you to. There are regimental histories that are being compiled for many of the Union regiments. These were done in the 19th century and 20th century, oftentimes with photographs of individual veterans. The pension office correspondence from an ancestor or a fellow soldier within the regiment is also going to give you some valuable insight. And also find out who your ancestors' friends and enemies were. Because in the pension, these affidavits would be to help your ancestor get a pension, or perhaps your ancestor assisted in getting the pension for someone he served with. Give some detail as to, I was at the particular battle with John Smith and I saw that he was injured at the Battle of Gettysburg. Or it might say, I knew John the entire time, and I know that when he got his pension application, he never saw any battles, and he's probably getting it from vicious means of tipping back the bottle. Yes, the non-military requests for pension for intestinal problems are very rampant through the pension files, and sometimes they had nothing to do with exposure from the war. So you can find out who his friends and neighbors really are. And of course, diaries and personal family letters are an amazing source if you have them, and that's why it's good to look outside of your own individual ancestor to see what other descendants are working. Now, the next tip is to review manuscripts in our own collection at NEHGS, and this involves the letters and diaries I spoke of. Perhaps you can find a letter or a diary from a member of a unit that your ancestor served with in our collection. Step 4. You want to determine whether or not your ancestor was killed or wounded in battle. With the over 600,000 lives lost during the Civil War, there's probably a good chance that one of your ancestors or a relative of your ancestor died during the Civil War. Sources include both the published records of the regimental histories. These will often list the unit's casualties by company or by the vessel. You may also find your ancestor is included in the Roll of Honor. This is an official government list that listed those buried in federal cemeteries during the Civil War of, in this case, just Union veterans. There are newspapers. We'll talk a little bit and show you an example of what a death register looks like from the state. It may give you a clue if whether the relative died during the war. There are the discharge papers. We're going to talk in length about pension files. We'll talk about gravestones. And again, another source that will tell you whether your ancestor died and has a widow is the 1890 U.S. Census and Special Schedule we looked at earlier. On NEHGS, we have external databases. One of these includes a great database of 19th century U.S. newspapers. And we also have extensive holdings at NEHGS, including microfilm of the Boston Evening Transcript from 1848 to 1912, and digital access of other newspapers that may be of use to you. One of the things you'll find in a newspaper that you'll find valuable are sometimes the listing of the casualties. This is a listing of casualties in the 29th Massachusetts Regiment, listing all of those who were lost in battle or were severely wounded. On the other side, this is an interesting list that came in from the soldiers arriving yesterday on the steamers Vanderbilt and Louisiana, giving a listing of all the wounded soldiers and specifically, as you can see, with what is their actual injury or ailment. The death registers are culled together. Every state is a little different. We're very lucky with Massachusetts, and we have them on our website, Ancestors.org. These are the death registers covering 1841 to 1915 for Massachusetts. And I want you to pay attention, if you have a Massachusetts veteran, to the 1861 to 65 death registers. Now, your ancestor may have died in Virginia, but you might find, as in the case of this one from Townsend, Massachusetts, that Allenson Withington, aged 19 years, was killed in battle in Suffolk, Virginia, and the fact that he is actually a soldier. Now, the next thing that we have in mind for you here is that the discharge for your ancestor. If he had left the service, there's going to be his certificate for discharge that he had to have when he passed over the lines. Otherwise, he's AWOL. Probably would have gone into the brig or worse. So if your ancestor, in this case, Francis Brackett, has an ailment, this certificate of discharge for disability, he would have held on very tightly as he headed back home or was sent to a camp hospital. Another thing that your ancestor would have got to prove his service is his Eagle discharge. This Eagle discharge was issued to Union soldiers and would say on it the name of the individual veteran, the regiment or company that he served in, and whether he was discharged honorably, and giving the date. This is a great document to have, and many of you may have the original copy in your ancestor's possessions, or you may find it when you're researching his pension. These are often sent in as evidence. Step 5. Search for the post-service records of your ancestor's life. Now, under the post-service records, we're going to talk about some things such as pension files, National Soldier Home Records, and the records of the Grand Army of the Republic. Now, pension files are available for wars earlier than the Civil War. In fact, you may have found your ancestor's Revolutionary War pension at one point in time. But the National Archives still retains the original pension files for all of the Union veterans, their widows, their children, their parents if they applied, and that goes up until the 1930s. But there is a split, and if you find on the index card of your ancestor XC or C, that means that the pension file could quite possibly still be with the Veterans Administration Office. Remember, the last widow died only in 2003, and the last veteran died in 1956. For those later, longer living veterans and widows, their pension files could be with the Veterans Administration and not at the National Archives. Now there are two indexes to be aware of. The T288 index is the index by name. The T289 index is the index by regiment. It became very important if you needed to contact other members of your ancestor's unit to see if his pension was applicable to an injury. Instead of looking for every John Smith, you could then look at the 12th Massachusetts Company I, Smith John. It made a lot more sense. So the government office came up with two indexes. Now the second index, the T289, also includes at the end of the card, we'll say the date of death in the place of death, where the T288 does not. Now who can apply for a pension? Well, if you're an invalid, if you're a widow, if you had dependents, especially a minor child. And as you can see on the card here, the T288 card, it has the date the person applied, it has their application number, and notice over here, the certificate number is blank. So they applied, but they unfortunately did not live long enough to get a pension. Their widow, however, did. The following, actually 2 years later in 1865, she applied, and his certificate number still was granted. So that's an important part. And then also you can look down here, there was a minor child in 1872 applying who also had an application and it was granted. Requesting copies of these cards. Again, it's the same as getting the compiled military service records, but instead of form NATF 86, you want NATF 85. Now the cost of getting a pension is slightly more expensive than getting an individual compiled military service record. The cost is $80 and they will copy up to 100 pages. Again, they will put it in both paper or CD or DVD copy for you. If it's over 100 pages, the charge is 70 cents per additional page. From what you can see here, you're going to put down the veteran's name, where he served from, the war, dates of birth and date of death become very important here to determining if they have the right file for you. But if you have obtained a T288 index or the T289 index, you may want to attach that if you're sending the form to the National Archives. That way you can be certain you've got all the numbers written down correctly. One of the things that you can do besides being able to use the form and printing off the PDF is that you can actually do it online with a credit card. And you can select your way of delivery, and again, remember, you can have it in paper form or on CD-ROM. I personally prefer the paper copy and then scan the documents I want. That way I have a hard copy of it and nothing is lost electronically. Tip: now when you visit the archives in Washington, bring a digital camera because you can copy those pages for free. $80 per pension file can get very costly, but if you can pull all the pension files you need, bring a blank camera card, probably for less than $20, you may get a great view of your ancestor's pension, and this time in color. Typical pension file papers include the following: the declaration for the pension and the pension application, the certificate of disability for your ancestor, the reason they actually applied for the pension. There may be a surgeon certificate, a questionnaires, a variety of questions they ask of great genealogical value. There are affidavits for the pensioner, correspondence, and bills and receipts. Now this right here is the declaration in 1920 that was created for a veteran. This William Oliver states his age is 72, that he enrolled in Portland, Maine, that he was honorably discharged in Richmond, Virginia, and that his physical description at the time of employment in the military is 5'5.5". He has light hair, rather light complexion, blue eyes, and brown hair. Now, one of the things that you're going to find is the surgeon certificate of if your ancestor has a disability. As you can see in this graphic description on the right, the ancestor has an injury through his right leg, and it also appears to be an injury in his right foot. So you can find out if there was an amputation or an injury in that respect. The forms included on the disability include the dates of the various examinations, the name and rank of the claimant's post office address, the cause of his disability, the amount of the pension that he actually got, and will give you a full description of the disabilities, sometimes in more detail than you care to know. Questionnaire 3-447 was used before 1902 and is a goldmine of genealogical information. It's giving the date of birth of the veteran, where he was born, when he enlisted. It also gives other things, like where your ancestor lived since his discharge. Well, that's a very valuable thing because you may not know where he lived after the Civil War, and it'll list by year and all the different residences he had. And also, genealogically speaking, since so many of us are looking into what our ancestors looked at, maybe you don't have a photograph, but maybe the physical description here may give you an interesting idea, including the permanent marks on his body. Your ancestor have a tattoo? Well, guess what? You're going to find out. The questionnaire form 3-389 was used as of 1915, and this has a nice variety of questions as well. This includes the date and birth of the ancestor, the state of the wife's name, and her maiden name. So that way you find out the full maiden name of your ancestor's wife or wives, when in fact they were married. Now, it's also curious if your ancestor was previously married to 1915, so it gives the previous marriages and specific information on that. And it's also curious about your current wife. Was she previously married before? And also, was she previously married to a veteran? It also asks you the names and dates and birth of all of your children, living and dead. Almost compiling a mini genealogy on this form if your ancestor lived to 50 years after the Civil War or his widow. Now, the widow's pension is also a very valuable thing and often is very poignant because she is asking for help because now her veteran has died. May have this been in 1861 or in 1931. These applications are very valuable, and they include veterans of both the Army, Navy, and the Marines for their widows. But what's nice about this form in 1916, it asks when and where the veteran's widow was born. Now, it isn't just the soldier that you get a pension or his widow. Children, the mother and father, and the dependent brothers could also apply for a pension. And I can tell you that the most detailed, heart-wrenching letters are those that were sent by the mother or the father of a veteran that included letters that the son sent from the battlefield. Now, they're not just any old letter. It's a letter that actually states that the son was sending some sort of financial means back home. And these letters were kept in the file and never returned. Maybe you have some of these letters and you're missing a chapter. The pension file might actually close that mystery for you. Affidavits and correspondence also populate a pension file. These include the sworn statements regarding the legitimacy of the veteran's claim. You may also find in it doctors, federal soldiers' homes, neighbors, politicians, anybody writing to prove that the ancestor's claim is a valid one. There are also guardian declarations for minor children and court documents relating to cost involved in the care of a particular child. There's also letters from the veteran or his family regarding his application. Remember when I showed you on the index card, sometimes there's not a certificate number? Well, in some cases, the veteran didn't get a pension, or his widow, or a family member. These are sometimes thicker files. Why? All of the correspondence to support their claim, and it could go on for years. Here's a particular affidavit. This case is for Henry Waugh, and he was a resident of Whitman, Massachusetts when he served. And this affidavit goes into his claim for a pension, and it also is to validate the pension for not himself, but for the widow of George Weld, who he served with in Company I, 12th Massachusetts. So a lot of times when you make your pension application, you may also want to do it in support of somebody you served with, or it may have requested that you go before a justice of the peace and make your claim, and you realize that, hey, maybe I can apply for a pension too. Oftentimes you find these dates correlate. When you adopt that company in the unit, you'll find that these dates sometimes all melded together. This is an example of one of the letters that I found in a pension file for a mother. She is sent in, and this letter describes in detail the battle that her son was at, and also goes into the fact that he's sending money home, basically proving that the mother or the father were in financial need of their now deceased son, and that they need to get his pension that he would have qualified for if he had lived. Now, a curious story that I came across a number of years ago was a story of this veteran on the right. Now, this veteran had sent a picture in his pension file. The picture was rather curious because he attached a note from the soldiers' home was that he had served in the Civil War and had shook hands with President Abraham Lincoln. And by all means, the federal government should give him his pension because they can prove he served and was at the White House and shook hands with the president, because somewhere there must be a list of all people that Abraham Lincoln met. Well, I've never seen such a list, but I do find it's curious. The photograph of this old gent here, probably taken in his backyard, to help identify him with maybe another picture of Abraham Lincoln from many years ago. Well, it's a nice document. But this is just an example of some of the things you get from soldiers' homes. This Chelsea Soldiers' Home still exists, and what this letter here is just one of many that you may find in pension files. They are mixed in with the case, and in some cases state pensions, state soldiers' homes or federal soldiers' home records are a valuable source to identify what your ancestor did after the war. Now, the other thing you're going to find populated in the pension file are the bills and receipts for the veteran. In this case, this is the last payment or the return check for a widow. This is for Catherine Holdcraft of Thurmont, Maryland, that in fact the pensioner died on February 13, 1917, and that they're returning her final check. This is why you need to look at all of the bills and the receipts in the file. That could be the only place that death is recorded. Tips for when visiting the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And may I add that NEHGS will be having a trip to Washington, D.C. this coming February 2015. You can find out more on our website, American Ancestors, under our education page. You want to go to the archives, copy all of the application certificate numbers carefully on your slips. You don't want them to return them back. You want to turn in the slips on a regular basis, especially if you have many requests. They'll have certain times during the day that you could submit them, or at the beginning of the day, you could submit all of your pulls for the day, go out, go to a museum, and come back in the afternoon. Copy the entire file and sort it out later, and don't forget to write down notes, and also don't forget the wrapper sheets. I'll explain that in a second. This is an example of the wrapper sheet for a federal pension, and what is on it is additional notes that were not found anywhere else in the pension. That's, in some cases, they categorize what's included, or sometimes they're final notes, such as this right here, that the veteran died August 25th, 1898, and where he died. So it's written on the folder, but maybe the document inside had been mislaid. So this may be your clue. Now, one of the things I like to do when I get a pension is to sort out the copies in chronological order. So first, you want to make a duplicate set. Make sure the front and backs are together, because you don't want to lose part of that story because you haven't attached them. And use one set in original order on how you found it. Leave it like that. But then take the other one and put it in chronological order. You will find a gold mine of information, and you will read this like a narrative timeline of your ancestor's life from the Civil War to when he died or to when his widow died. The Grand Army of the Republic records, unfortunately, are not in any centralized repository. You can find these in places like public libraries, historical societies, and in some places extremes like eBay. Yes, even online you can find these valuable records for sale, and photographs are also very valuable because they're often group photographs taken, like the example on the bottom, and also individual photographs often were hung around the GAR hall of the veterans. There are also annual encampment records. These annual encampments might be the returns and the reports of the particular GAR post, giving the members who the officers were and what events they did. You might find newspaper articles in your local newspaper on microfilm, and these would include such things as Memorial Day, formerly known as Decoration Day, where they would go through and they would actually decorate the graves, hence the Memorial Day we have now, started by the veterans of the Civil War. This is an example of a sketchbook from Post 72 GAR Post in Stoughton, Massachusetts, for a Jedediah Morse bird who died back in 1919. This sketch gives when he was born, when he enlisted, his entire military service. This down here gives all of the particulars of when he joined the post and what offices he held. And in the records is an identified photograph of Jedediah Bird and the unit in which he served with. One thing I'd like to offer is some additional reading that you might try. You don't need to be a member of NEHGS to access our AmericanAncestors.org website for our magazine here. This is an article I wrote in fall of 2011. Our website is generally a subscription-based website, but this article is free for you to view. And this is on my strategies for tracing your Civil War veterans in the Union Army and Navy.
All right, well, thank you, David, for that wonderful presentation. And of course, as you were presenting, we received a number of questions. So let's start getting to those. Again, if you have a question, go ahead and type it in the question field within your user panel. So we have a few questions regarding locating the burial location of a Union soldier ancestor. What advice can you give them?
Well, if the soldier lived after the Civil War, it's going to be a little difficult to know exactly where until you know where they were living. For instance, if you have them in the 1870 census, the 1880 census, the 1890 special schedule, determine physically where they're living, try to get their death record. Most 20th century and late 19th century death records include the cemetery or at least the town they're buried in. If you contact the veterans agent of that particular town, they often have a listing of where the veterans are buried, including those from the Civil War. You may also try website findagrave.com and see if somebody's actually posted the individual's veteran's grave. And also the Sons of Union Veterans are starting a database now for, actually it's been on for a few years, that actually is recording the burial spots of Union veterans.
Okay, and if their ancestor died in battle, what kind of burial practices would be done in that case?
Well, there's the Roll of Honor, which is the published list, which you can also find on the commercial website Ancestry.com. This is a published set of books that we have at NEHGS, and it lists state by state where the national cemeteries are. It assigns both a grave number, the name of the veteran or their unit, and the vessel they served on if they're buried in a national cemetery. If they died during the war, the family may have chose to have the body sent further than the battlefield and brought up north by a steamer or train, and that they would be buried in a local cemetery. Again, the rules apply just as they were if they died after the war, following the steps of contacting the veterans agent in the town, also seeing if they're on sites like Find a Grave, or investigating what cemeteries are in a particular community that have a cemetery that are from 1861 forward.
Now, Terry asks, if someone deserted, would they still be eligible for a pension file, and might there be additional records available in the case of a desertion?
Unfortunately, because they deserted, unless they were proven afterwards that the desertion was because the record was falsified. I shouldn't say falsified, but so much as on a muster roll, occasionally you could be listed as AWOL. Well, you're AWOL because you're a prisoner of war. You couldn't show up to muster. They may not realize this for weeks or months or even years after the fact. So in that case, a person could apply for a pension, and there may be some discussion in correspondence to clarify why they're listed as deserted, but if they did desert and the record clearly says that they could not apply for a pension. Now that isn't to stop people from applying, and that's a lot of times when you find the certificate number not written down on that index, it's because it is a request from a person who went AWOL at some point in time in his service, and the federal government has proven that he honorably was not discharged. So that would be the case. However, if you want to find detail, look at his compiled military service jacket or on the logbooks of the naval vessel that he was attached with, because they should go into some detail as to when the person deserted. And in the service jackets and the compiled military service records for NATF 86, that you make that request for $30, that may have actual accounts as when he was last seen, what he actually took with him, because a lot of times they're taking their gun and they're taking their uniform, so they would be chargeable for that if they were caught, if not worse.
All right, and Karen asks, so if you go to the National Archives in DC, is there a cost for making copies of pension records?
Yes, they do charge a cost from a regular coin-operated card machine. When you buy a copy card, you add value to it. The price is relatively cheap. I believe the cost currently is under 50 cents. But I find the best way to do it is to actually go forward with a digital camera, because that is the best way to get both a color copy and be able to copy everything under your own conditions. And with the color copiers that they do avail at the archives, oftentimes these copies have to be mailed to you. So again, the best way, you bring your digital camera, you can even bring a tripod if you wish, and just make the copies yourself. That is the cheaper option.
Lisa asks, where would one look for medical records if a soldier was brought to a battlefield hospital?
There's actually two places that you can actually look for medical records. One would be in the compiled military service record of the Ancestor, because it will have that he had a disability, and they will probably have a sheet from the hospital where it stated that he was in a hospital bed for a certain time frame. You may also find it obviously in the pension file, because that injury or ailment may have been a reason for getting a pension down the road. And the other place that you're going to find is that at the National Archives, they have a lot of these camp hospital, or in some cases hospitals in Washington, D.C., or set up in other cities that kept the records and have hospital logbooks. And these logbooks are very valuable because it will tell you when the person went into the hospital, when they left, whether or not they left on their own 2 feet or they sadly died, and it may give a mention of a relative's name, give you obviously the unit or the vessel they were associated with, what their ailment was, and in some cases details as to what services were provided. If they were sick or injured, they may talk about what supplies were given to him or how much the cost was involved.
All right, and Susan asks, did men generally enlist in the state in which they currently lived, or might they return to their state of birth in order to enlist?
In the case of most veterans, they usually enlist in their hometown. However, you could go and enlist pretty much anywhere in the Union states, because some of the states and the towns had quotas they had to fill. So for instance, the town of Stoughton may have needed to fill by a state request 100 soldiers. Well, maybe they could only muster in 78. Well, where are the other 22 coming from? They would offer bonuses, and these bonuses are a little extra money to be put forward if the person signed up with that town's quota. There are many veterans from my hometown that never even lived in my hometown that are listed as veterans from Stoughton, Massachusetts. So in this case, your ancestor could go back home to where he was born necessarily. They may have just gone to where the better money was, or maybe they went back home to enlist because that's where their dad was, or maybe they had a sibling and they wanted to be in the same unit, but it was not a requirement.
And kind of along those same lines, Teresa asks, are there any special tips for those who served in the Union Army but came from states in the Confederacy? Are there any additional search strategies that you could offer?
Well, one thing that actually is present is that your ancestor may have served in the Confederacy, was captured, and became what is called a galvanized Yankee. Essentially, they would be given duty in the military, but generally not speaking were they ever given a gun, in case they changed their mind again. There are some exceptions to that, however. If your ancestor left a southern state and joined the Union Army before having been enlisted in the Confederacy, or they just happened to be living up here. Maybe they were born in South Carolina, moved up when they were 10. You're really not having to look for anything specific because the place of birth of the veteran is really non-consequential when you're getting into the research. It's nice to find it, but it doesn't change your search strategy. Your search strategy circulates around where they enlisted, maybe the state or the town, not where they were born.
Okay, and maybe just a few more questions before we wrap up for today. Can you kind of talk, we have a few questions about this. Would you be able to find those pension files you talked about at the National Archives in your more local National Archives? So, you know, would those pension files also be available, say, at the archives in Waltham, Massachusetts?
Ultimately, as we move forward in technology, sites like Fold3 and Ancestry.com and Find My Past are probably going to try to go forward and digitize these records. But currently, the original paper copies of the majority of the Civil War pensions are only at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Now, it's not to say that Fold3 hasn't started digitizing Civil War pension files, and naval pension files are actually available to a great degree right online with Fold3. But the paper copies, if you're hoping to handle the record, you're going to have to go to Washington in that case.
Okay, and Keith asks, does the pension file include data not in the service file?
Yes, Keith. Actually, the pension file is usually much more voluminous than a compiled military service jacket record because what it's in the jacket for the compiled military service just relates to their service. So there's not even going to be an indication if the soldier lived one day after 1865. It might have some annotations that the person in the War Department office or the Department of Interior was searching through that file to find proof of his service, but the bulk of his soldier life, including sometimes complete copies of the compiled military service record, will be found in the pension for proof of his service. And of course, after 1865, right up until the day that he died, in cases like these veterans late in the 20th century, you're gleaning almost like a year-by-year examination of their medical history, their work history, their health, their marital status, their children. As you saw, one of the forms actually mentions when the children were living and dead. So the pension file far exceeds what's on the compiled military service record. And it's also by volume, hundreds of pages sometimes for a pension file, where a compiled military service record is generally never over 100 pages. In most cases, they're never over 25, 30 in most cases.
All right, and how about one last question? Anne asks, are there records or perhaps lists for Irish immigrants who enlist?
Well, there are a lot of units that were primarily Irish units in Massachusetts. The 9th Mass was an Irish brigade, if you will, and there are other states that had all Irish units. They would often sometimes be mustered up, and in cases of some, they recruited right at the docks. So there's not one compiled list of all veterans that were Irish that I've ever seen. I would think by assumption of surname you could probably gather some of the Irish surnames, but names like Smith and Jones it might be a little bit tough. So the answer really is no. There's not a compiled ethnic list. Now there are some specific ones, like there are actually veterans that were Chinese that served in the Civil War, I believe down in the Philadelphia area and other places. So that is where you find the smaller groups, Canadian-born veterans. There's a multitude of those. There's no compiled list, and that's even a smaller ethnic group than, say, the Irish. So right at the moment, no, but who's to say what the future might bring.
All right, well, thank you again so much, David. It's been a wonderful presentation, and thank you everyone for your questions. If you have more detailed questions about the specifics of your research, do consider scheduling a consultation or possibly even hiring our research services team. If you're interested in learning more about those services, you can write to the email addresses on the current slide, and I'll also include that information in my follow-up email to you tomorrow. Thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to develop and improve our webinars and other online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful, so I do thank you in advance. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center, americanancestors.org/learning-center. I hope you'll join us for future online programs. Goodbye for now.